in Think Like a Filmmaker is about the verbal artist. So we're going to think like screenwriters today. Words are something that are so important to worship. Words are, of course, we just assume that we're going to have words. But I think sometimes we don't think creatively enough about words. We sort of have these forms that we use, that we've been using for a long time, and we think that visuals and media and music are the things that we're creative with, but words actually hold a lot of possibility for creating a sensory-rich environment. And so we need to take care with our words. We need to think about how we can creatively use our words so that we bring the message alive. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Is Chapter 4, Think Like a Filmmaker, the verbal arts in worship. Okay, friends, so the verbal arts, before we get there, I want to just remind you that we have a fully scripted, meaning all the words are there for you, and it's a great way to see some of these things I'm going to talk about in action. Fully scripted Advent Christmas series called God Bless Us Everyone, The Redemption of Scrooge. The slide says coming September 14th. We're obviously past that, and it's out. And so you can go to worshipdesignstudio.com/Scrooge and take a look at those. Again, we've just started this year doing these fully scripted services, and I'm getting reports back that churches are so grateful to see in action all of these concepts, all of these sensory-rich concepts that I talk about in the book come to life. And when we give you the full scripts and all of the suggestions for music and for visuals and for media, all of these things, you can see how it's all put together. I'm going to use some examples from this series in our webinar today. So you'll get a little sneak peek if you haven't ordered those yet. So in Chapter 4, Think Like a Screenwriter, words are symbolic. We talk about, these are the chapter headings, the experience of words. It's not just about what's on the page, but when we are verbal artists, we are creating for live bodies in the moment, not just for people to read. So the experience of words is important. Words are visual. What? Words are visual. We try to paint pictures, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Words have to move. The verbal transition, writing liturgy, and writing sermons. So we're going to get to just a little bit of each one of these things, just as a little insight into what that chapter is. And if you have the book already, you may have read this chapter already, or you may just be getting to it. And if you don't have the book, be sure to go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com. We have the link to Amazon. You can order it from us. If you get 3 or more copies, you get a discount because we want you to study this with your team. Okay, so the experience of words. This is so vitally important. As you know, those of you who've been reading the book, I interviewed filmmakers to see what they know that could help us with our creative process. And Jan Borsten has a book called Making Movies Work that just was full of wisdom. And he said the quickest way to deaden the audience's impulse to join in, imagine that. Here's a movie maker wanting the audience to join in. That's certainly what we do as worship designers. We want people to join in. But here's also a filmmaker saying, we want the audience not just to be passive onlookers. We want them to be invested in the movie. We want them to see themselves in the movie, to be experiencing it along the way. And so screenwriters are going to write words that draw us into the experience. So the quickest way to deaden the audience's impulse is to join in, is to tell too much. Oh my gosh. And it is remarkable how little can be too much. He says exposition that is crystal clear on the page baffles on screen. So the real talent of screenwriters is to write words that then living folks embody, and which invites us in without over-explaining, without saying too much, without us getting lost in the verbiage. So I think this is really interesting as I talk to screenwriters, really interesting that they have this skill, and it feels like these are the skills that liturgists need as well, those of us who are creating words for worship. So The impulse to tell too much, resist, resist. Okay, so words are symbolic. In the verbal arts for worship, the words of worship are more like poetry than prose. In my musical theater career, I played Eliza Doolittle, and there is a wonderful little what we call a patter song in that musical that says, "Words, words, words, I'm so sick of words." And what's funny about the song is that it's about how she's sick of words, and yet she uses run-on words to tell the story. That's what a patter song is. It just tons of words. So we have this love-hate relationship with words in worship, friends. Sometimes we have too many words. What's interesting is I can always tell when a preacher has not gotten to the editing process. Because you think they're coming in for a landing. Oh, this is going to be a great message. We're getting to the finale. We're getting to the main message. And then, boom, they turn a corner. And, sometimes we tell too much, even in our sermons, even though, that is the most usually verbally rich part of the service. Sometimes we don't get to the editing process, and we perhaps say too much. We tell one illustration too much, or we stay in the area of abstract concepts rather than concrete ideas. Sometimes we don't use enough words on the other end of the spectrum. So, for instance, when we think about what we say in between parts of the service, sometimes we might say, "And now let us turn to hymn number such and such and sing." When in fact we could, as spiritual directors, as leaders, we could actually say something that helps people get into the song more rather than just where it is. That's what a worship guide is for, right? A bulletin, to help us know where that is. You might mention that if you think that's necessary, but you might also say, this is a song that calls us, just as Jesus called his disciples, it is calling us to our discipleship, right? And so right away, what we give folks in a very concise, short sentence that you work on ahead of time, so you don't say too much, but it helps give us a frame of reference for that song, and people get to see it through that lens. So sometimes we don't use enough words in our worship. And then, as I said, sometimes we use too many abstract concepts. We stay in the land of theology and theory, which is not bad, but we also have to marry those concepts to more concrete examples. And that's what I mean by words are symbolic. The symbols are the very first and most important language of our worship. And so our words have to paint pictures as well. Getting concrete examples to help us understand these abstract concepts of our theology is so important. And then finally, sometimes we have too much explanation. We just over-explain. And especially if we don't work on our instructions beforehand, sometimes we can trip over ourselves, say too much, and it can be too much. So we really have to work to craft our words. And not just the sermon, not just the liturgy that's written, but all of those things we say off the cuff as well can really make a big difference. Okay, so Alan Palmer is an Australian screenwriter, and he has a blog called Cracking Yarns, which is what the Aussies, the down under folks, call storytelling. And so he's a film analyst and a teacher of screenwriting, and I really enjoyed studying his work. He says, while the best screenwriters tend also to be great wordsmiths, I don't think that we are fundamentally in the word business. What does he mean, not fundamentally in the word business as writers? He says words are not the end product. It's not enough that what you put on the page sounds good to your ear. The words ultimately are only there to serve a higher goal. What is that goal? The goal is to move the audience. So in his screenwriting, he's telling people, screenwriters who are creating words, is that it doesn't matter how beautiful the words are that you put together, how much wordsmithing you did. Does it translate? Does it communicate? Not only does it communicate, but does it communicate for the purpose of moving the audience into further deeper into the story and into them seeing the story as their story. And certainly that's what we want to do as worship designers as well. He also says that when you're writing, it's heart first, head second. Wow, we could really listen to this, right? Because what we know about the heart or emotions is that emotions are the motivator for our actions. And it's not just pure emotions, right? I mean, that can easily slip into a manipulation. But it's also the concepts we're trying to talk about. How are they connected to our hearts, to our emotions, and therefore more motivating? So he says, so after you've written your screenplay, or better yet, even after you've written your outline, don't read it with a view to how comprehensively you've satisfied the theory. Hear this, folks. It's not just about how have we completely given the folks the exegesis that we went through, which is very important. But when it comes down to it, we're going to do more exegesis than we give to the folks. We're going to distill that into the most provocative things that need to be told in order to get the point across, in order to move our folks. So don't read it with a view to how comprehensively you've satisfied the theory. Read it for how it makes you feel. Encourage others whom you entrust your drafts to do the same. Does it move you? Now, I think this is interesting. He's inviting screenwriters to entrust their drafts to somebody else to get a different perspective and ask them, did this move you? How often do we actually take the steps to share what we've prepared verbally for worship with anybody else? I know that preaching is a very personal act. But, sometimes I think we don't do ourselves any favors by keeping it so close to the chest, so private, that we can't find someone to bounce these things off of. Because when we rehearse these things out loud or show them to someone else, what we do is we look through someone else's eyes and we hear with somebody else's ears. Even if you're practicing to the plant or an empty sanctuary like I do, I go in whenever I'm preaching and I'm going to practice that aloud in the sanctuary. I'm going to mark out my movements, where I want to be when, and I'm going to listen to myself. And I can tell when I have lost even me. Even I am getting bored with my own words, right? We have to say it out loud. And we have to say it with the idea of, have I lost my audience? Have I lost my hearers, my listeners? Or have I moved them somewhere? And movement is an actual thing, even in our sermons. It's not, even though folks are sitting and listening, we have to move them in their minds and hearts, in their imaginations. Have we painted a picture that moves them from one scene to the next in their imagination? That brings a kinesthetic piece to it, which we're going to talk about in a minute. A kinesthetic piece to it, even if they're sitting still. In their minds, they are moving from one scene to the next. We are painting pictures. So are we moving, folks? Okay, so let's take an example of a call to worship. The call to worship is I need to do some research on the history of the call to worship. Like, is this super ancient, the way that we do it now, where we have leader, people, and everybody has a line, one line each, and it's all different. I get so bored with these. I have to tell you, I get really bored with these because it feels static. It's very symmetrical, one line each, and unison speaking in general is very difficult for people to comprehend, stay together, and be moved at the same time. So let's take a look at this example. It's the leader says, "This is the Lord's day, the day of wonder and grace." And then the people say, "This is the day to worship the one who calls us here." Then the leader says, "This is the Lord's day, the day we are given joy and peace." The people say, "This is the day promised to us, the day of healing and renewal." The leader says, "This is the Lord's day, and it has come just in time." The people say, "This is the day we gather with hope, with faith, with love." Okay, so we've got some concepts in there. We're saying what we have come to do. This is the day we are, and we're saying, what is this day full of? Okay, good content, right? Important content. We hear some repetition, which is awesome. This is the Lord's day. We hear that several times. So I'm going to refashion this and see if we can make it move a little bit more and therefore move the folks. So on this next slide, what I have here is this refashioned call to worship. So the leader says, actually, what I would start with, I wouldn't even have this in the bulletin, in the worship guide, because the people's part is going to be the same line every time. And maybe you have it in the worship guide or on the screens, but the point is that we're going to give the people something to say. We're going to give them that repetitive element. This is the Lord's day. And we're going to give the leader most of the cognitive content, because when we are listening as congregation, we are able to take in cognitive content more easily, more readily, when there is varies in the tone of voice, when the emotion of the reader is helping us to hear what's being said, when we don't have to work to stay together with other people because it creates this kind of rhythm in order to stay together. And so we suck some of the emotion out of it when we do that. So the leader would say, friends, your response is, this is the Lord's day. And then perhaps I would open my arms to the congregation and have them repeat that, this is the Lord's day. Then the leader would say, this is the day to worship the one who calls us here, the day of wonder and grace. All I have to do is point to the congregation and they say, this is the Lord's day. This is the day promised to us. Now it's back to the leader. This is the day promised to us, the day of healing and renewal, the day we are given joy and peace. This is the Lord's day, says the people. Now, the leader says the last line. This is the day we gather with hope, with faith, with love. And it has come just in time. This is the Lord's day, says the people all together. So you see how I've given the people a punctuation mark. They get to have, they get to be moved. The whole thing moves because the reader, the one reader, or you could have three different voices, which I think is it's always helps us perk our ears up because the voice changes. But the leader gets to read this with the right emotion, they get to vary the rhythm. We get to hear the content better. And then the congregation gets to have this punctuation mark that offers them a chance in a short phrase to bring energy to it. I hope this makes sense. This is the way we make words move us more, the way that we take in the information better. So just think about this in terms of mixing it up, these calls to worship. I often do this kind of thing where there's a repetitive phrase, and I will use the same repetitive phrase throughout a series, a worship series. And then, of course, the leader parts would be different based on what we're focusing on that day. Now, when I talk about threshold moments in the book, the threshold moment is like a call to worship on steroids, right? So sometimes I think we don't need to have the typical call to worship, especially if we do that a lot and all, especially all the time. I think it gets a little bit rote. And especially if we do welcome and announcements, and then without singing anything, we just say, now let us stand for our call to worship. We are so in our heads. We haven't had anything that takes us into a spiritual place. And so even if you use a call to worship like this with leader people, I would suggest in that the same vein as I teach around the threshold moment, why not have a little refrain that is your theme song for the series? Sing that first. Have people stand, sing that first, and then go into the call to worship. Maybe even keep the music going underneath, and then sing that refrain again. What it does is it helps us not start worship from a cold kind of didactic kind of place. It helps us to get our hearts and our minds, our whole bodies into worship in that moment. Okay, so let's move on to another part of the verbal arts chapter, and that is talking more about synopses. We talked about synopses in the first chapter, and I'm just bringing it back up because it is an important part of that verbal art form. Synopses are those 2 to 3, 4 sentence paragraphs, descriptions of the series itself and then of each Sunday. And you're going to use those in so many different ways, from publicity to letting folks know what's coming up, to using those in perhaps your threshold moment as you introduce the service for the day, getting people that lens to look through. So writing synopses is a really great discipline to start to use, and it's very much a verbal art form. So let's just revisit it. Ask yourself, if I came to the homepage of our website and saw this description of the series, this synopsis, would it feel like a meaningful spiritual journey to be on? Would I want to know more? Would I come to worship? And so a synopsis is going to really bring forth a few goals, and that is the dilemma, the message, and the question, or the why. I often end a synopsis in a question, and really what this does is it's my leaping off point for the service, and especially the sermon, right? The sermon's going to answer the question. So let's look at this example from one of the Worship Design Studio series. And for those of you who are new to my work, Worship Design Studio is my coaching website where we have now 56 worship series to help jumpstart you and give you ideas. This one was a fairly new one for us. It's called The Outsiders. And really the whole series, well, let me do the synopsis so you can see what the whole series is about. And how this connects to filmmakers is that screenwriters write what they call log lines. And log lines are those descriptions that on your phone, when you go to your movie app and you want to see what movie you want to go to, there's descriptions. That's a log line. And that's why I say, if we do log lines or synopses for our series, we put it on our website, it helps people to, perhaps visitors, to go, oh, that sounds interesting. Let's go to that. Okay, so this is the series synopsis or log line for The Outsiders. So the dilemma is, have you ever felt like a third wheel? Life on the outside of the in crowd can make it difficult to fit in, to feel at home. And then I move on. My second sentence is the message. The Gospel of Luke chronicles Jesus' ministry with those on the so-called outside, right, with quotes. So already I've said, what's a dilemma? Sometimes we feel like we're not part of the in crowd. It's difficult to fit in, to feel at home. We're sort of setting up, who are we talking about here in terms of the outsiders? Then I say, what's the context? What are we going to do with that? Well, the Gospel of Luke shows that Jesus' ministry was with those on the so-called outside. And then the question, or the why of the series, why are we doing this? What can we learn from these stories and Jesus' call to turn the inside out and the outside in, right? So that is my jumping off point. Each of the Sundays is going to have a synopsis to it with a question that I'll deal with in the sermon for that Sunday. But the overall question is, what is the overarching question we're using for the entire series? And when we communicate that clearly to folks, boy, they're right on that journey with us. They hear the music with that lens. And so everything we choose for music, people can see the connections because we've given them that jump start, that synopsis. The visuals that they see are more likely, they're more likely to go, oh, I get that, right? Because they are attuned to what the message is. Okay. Yeah, I see in the chat box, the synopsis is kind of like your elevator speech for what's coming up in worship. Absolutely. That's a great analogy. Okay, so I started talking about verbal transitions. This is another part of the book, part of the chapter on verbal arts. So verbal transitions are those ways that we move from being a bureaucrat of the program, right, saying what's next, to being an enlivener of the people's spiritual experience. We want them to be in the journey, to be all in the journey. And when we pay attention to the ways that we're going to introduce certain parts of the service, and not everything needs a verbal introduction, right? That can be as monotonous as not ever having verbal transitions, right? It gets anything that gets predictable gets, after a while we start with the eye rolling, because it gets predictable. But sometimes you really want people to experience the next thing in a certain way, and helping them to do that through a verbal introduction can be really, really helpful. And so that's kind of what we want to work on. And, when you look at my worship scripts, when I'm leading worship, it's crazy. One of the reasons why I do all of my worship scripts center justified is because I have room in the margins, plenty of white space in the margins, to write out my verbal transitions, because I will often do that as I do my walkthrough of the service. A few days before the service, if I'm doing it, at a church where I'm there a few days before the service as a guest, I'm often there just right before the service. So I'll do it. I'll get to the worship space. I'll ask people, when is the first person in the building? And I want to be there a half an hour before they are, because I want, or not in the building, but in the sanctuary, because I want some time alone to go through the entire service. And I walk myself through the entire service, and I think, okay, do I need a verbal introduction to this? Would it be helpful if I just had a sentence to help people into that spiritual experience? And I will write those out in the margin. Now, I don't read them right off my page, but as we're getting to that place in the service, I'll glance at that. I'll remember what my frame of mind was and what I was thinking in that moment, and then I'll speak it. Not reading it, but I'll speak it aloud, looking at the congregation. And it might have changed a bit, because live worship is never exactly as you imagine it's going to be. Things happen, and so you might change that up a bit. But I do think it's important to go through the whole service and think about, where do I want to have verbal transitions? All right, so writing liturgy. I go on in the chapter to talk about writing liturgy, and I believe that everyone can write liturgy. In fact, I know it. In my workshops where I have people writing things, I never have somebody who says, I can't do it. Everybody always is able to put something on paper. So here's what makes the difference, is that you don't make people start from scratch. It's about getting a good structure, and prayer forms have a great structure. There's so many different structures for writing liturgy, and you play with metaphors in a poetic way. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those things. Of course, the book goes into much more detail on this, but let me just give you a couple of them. The collect form is an ancient prayer form. And, actually, this form I pulled out of Ruth Duck's book, Finding Words for Worship, which is a fabulous little book. If you want to really dive into some more about writing than I could get to in my book, I highly recommend her book, Finding Words for Worship, because it gives you the format. It helps you learn to write and practice that. So the collect form has 5 parts. Name for God. So we come up with a metaphor for God, because that's what a name for God is, right? God is unnameable. And so the only way we can address God is by using a metaphor. And so in this prayer form, I use God, our help and guide, right? So we're going to describe God. Then the second line is to tell what God does that makes that name appropriate. Why did you call God our help and guide? Well, I wrote, time and again we find ourselves struggling only to remember that you have never left our side. You have never left our side. So I've just said, why is it I called God our help and guide? The third line is make a petition or a request of God. We're going to ask God for something, right? Strong language to say, this is what we need, God. So in this prayer, walk with us this day, one step at a time, especially when the same mistakes repeat themselves in our lives. Now, this is right out of the book. I give you the context in the book for this prayer. It was a service where we were going to have somebody who's in a 12-step program giving a testimony about how their lives were turned around. Now, the fourth line, why we make the request. What is the desired outcome? And usually that starts with so that, so that. So line 3 says, walk with us this day, one step at a time, especially when the same mistakes repeat themselves in our lives, so that we can discover the paths you have for us. Right? So walk with us, one step at a time, show us the paths you have for us. And then finally, the 5th line is words of praise. We give you thanks and praise for 2nd, 3rd, 4th chances to know you, follow you, be loved by you. And so that's a neat little prayer form. And you just, I mean, when I do this in workshops, it's amazing. People go, oh my gosh, I just wrote a prayer. But you just need a structure, right? And then you can use your own words, your own context. The context is important because that's where we get the metaphors. What's the context of the service so that that prayer fits with the theme of the service? And not only that it fits with the theme, but that we have a storehouse of words to use rather than just starting from scratch. When we start from scratch with prayers, our prayers start to sound the same over and over and over again. So that's why it's so great to be working with a theme, because that theme is going to give you words. Okay. So let me share with you a benediction that I wrote for the God Bless Us Everyone, the Redemption of Scrooge series. So at the end, the anchor image, and we talked about anchor images in last month's webinar about the visual artist, the anchor image is the bell in the Scrooge story. Every time a spirit from the past, present, or future visits him, the clock tower chimes the bell. And so our anchor image is the bells. And so at the end of the service, we're going to have the handbells ringing out as the acolyte brings the light to the center of the community, and they all turn and face this light. So the benediction, let me just give you a bigger view of that. Okay. It says, there's a little Scrooge in each of us, holding on to the fear and despair we have experienced in our lives. Now, this is from week 2, which is about the ghost of Christmas past, right? And so the whole service has been about looking at our past and dealing with those past hurts, regrets, and joys. All right, so every benediction in the series will start out with, there's a little Scrooge in each of us. But then the second line is going to go on to bring in the context from that service, holding on to the fear and despair we have experienced in our lives. This week, may you be visited by, now that is in every benediction in the series. This week, may you be visited by, right? So Scrooge is visited by these ghosts. And week 2, we have hope as the main word. That's the Advent candle that we lit. So I say, this week, may you be visited by a surprising hope that may invite you to let go of those things of your past that no longer serve you. So I'm giving people some homework here, right? Or saying, here's what I hope you're blessed with. The surprising hope that invites you to let go of the things of your past that no longer serve you. So every week I'm going to use that same structure. This week, may you be visited by, the first week was peace. So I said, a peace that surpasses your understanding. That may invite you to, and then that part of the sentence is going to be different every week because it has to do with a different thing. And then the next line is going to be the same every week. And when you feel it, even if for just a fleeting moment, know that the miracle has just begun in you for the sake of the whole world. That whole line is the same every week because that applies to whatever you've just set up, whatever the context of that service. And the words, know the miracle has just begun in you, is a repetition of our theme song, our threshold song that has in it, the miracle has begun in you, right? So I'm connecting the dots. When you can repeat phrases from the beginning of the service to the end of the service or weave them into the service thematically, that's so satisfying for people. Repetition with adaptation is great, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. And then the very last, the blessing part after that, is going to be the same every week. May you be blessed by our God who loves you deeply, by Jesus, the true gift of God to each of us, this season and in all our days, and the Spirit who shows up just in time. So I have the Trinitarian blessing there, and that is going to be the same every week. Folks love repetition within a series. It gives the series a flavor. It becomes something that seeps into our memory. And gosh, repetition with adaptation is just a terrific structure. So I hope that's helpful to you. And I hope you're seeing that it's so much better. It's just my opinion, but it's so much better, I think, when you're doing series, that you write your own prayers rather than just pulling them out of a book. You can do it. You can absolutely do it. And here's the thing. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, because what you do is you create the first service. And then there I have my benediction, let's say, for the first service. And then I know which parts I want to tweak. I see the structure in it. That's what we have to train our minds to do, is to see the structure. And then I can easily do all of the benedictions for every Sunday all at the same time as I'm designing. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's do, one of my favorite things to do is to create a great Thanksgiving, a communion prayer for every series that I do. In the Advent Christmas series that I created, the fully scripted one for God Bless Us Everyone, there's actually two. If you're a church that does one Sunday a month, then I did that for that first Sunday of the month, which happens to be the second Sunday. Same one we just looked at the benediction for. And then Christmas Eve, I created two different prayers for that second Sunday of Advent and for Christmas Eve. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is to write communion liturgy based on the theme. Now, the way that I do that is I follow the structure of the ecumenical standard, really, that many denominations are using. It's based on Hippolytus' prayer from the 2nd century. And what is on the slide right now is the deep structure. It is the structure that we can follow. And when we follow that structure, it ensures that we give the prayer its due in terms of all the parts, but we can write within that our own words rather than using the same communion prayer every Sunday, or getting so bored by that we start hack and slashing the prayer and leaving out some really important parts. So the deep structure for the prayer is the preface, the Lord be with you and also be with you, lift up your hearts, we lift them up to the Lord, etc. The second part of the structure is Thanksgiving 1, where we thank God for what God has done, God's action in the world. Then we do the Sanctus, that's the holy, holy, holy part. Then the fourth one is Thanksgiving 2, which we've done Thanksgiving 1, has to do with the first person of the Trinity. Then we go to Jesus' action in the world in Thanksgiving 2, God's action through Jesus. He healed the sick, he fed the hungry. In the sort of standard prayer, we get sort of this list of what Jesus did. Then we go to the words of institution, the do this in remembrance of me part, where we tell the story. The next part is the memorial acclamation. That is where we affirm the life, resurrection, and promise of continued new life through Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Then we go on to the epiclesis, which is the petition for transformation. We petition the Holy Spirit. Pour out on us your Holy Spirit. And that is a part that sometimes gets hacked and slashed. Sometimes we think that if we're going to do part of the prayer, it's the words of institution only that are the most important part. And actually, it's not. That's just the storytelling part. Asking the Holy Spirit to transform us. Pour out your Spirit on us gathered here and on these gifts of bread and wine. So we want to ask for transformation in that part. And then the closing Eucharist or great thanks, sort of, we give you thanks, O God. And oftentimes we'll do a Trinitarian recap. All right, so what I do when I'm writing a communion prayer for a series is that I will use circle mapping. And that's what you're seeing right here. You put the central main metaphor in there, and then you come up with lots of words around it. And every time you go out to another satellite of the words, what you're doing is you're getting more and more concrete. It's kind of like human thesaurus. You're making your brain a thesaurus, and you're trying to come up with lots of words to help you get some fodder for the prayer. Now, let me just show you how I did this for the God Bless Us Everyone series. We start with the confession and assurance, and what I'm going to do, I wrote a little song, Ring Out Your Truth, that is used every Sunday in prayer time. But because the communion prayer is going to replace the main prayer time in the second Sunday, I'm going to use that song. I don't want to skip a Sunday with that theme song, especially because it's the second Sunday. If you don't have it repeating again, it just looked like it was a one-off. So I'm going to use that song, and I'm going to use the tune when we get to some of the people's response in the prayer. So the song goes, ring out your truth, ring out your love, reverberate in our lives, come Lord, come. So then it says, come all you who are haunted by past disappointments and scattered dreams. Hello, right? We're in the ghost of Christmas past. So right away we have the theme. Come, you who feel burdened by the patterns set up early in life. Come, you who yearn to start anew. This is the table of redemption, right? That word redemption is in our title. So this is the table of redemption. This is the table of transformed lives. Now, redemption and transformation were part of what I put in my circle map so that I could get more and more words. In this time of silence, I invite you to silently lift up to God the dim corners of your life, of your history, of your past, that you desire to be illumined by God's unending forgiveness. Now, I use that word illumined because guess what we're going to do when we come to worship, when we come to communion? I'm going to have a couple of tables set up for people to light candles. This particular service also, because it's the Ghost of Christmas Past, I'm incorporating some elements of Blue Christmas in it. And so those candles are going to be representative of those folks that we are in our past who are no longer with us, that we're yearning for, that we are, and so I'm using that word illumined, right? So then silence, and then out of the silence, the bells softly toll and the prayer song is sung again, right? But softly this time, right? We're coming out of silence, so it's really important. Just as sure as the bells ring out this moment. Aha, so we're hearing the bells, right? So the words are reinforcing. This is what I mean by sensory rich, right? That all the things are working together. Just as sure as the bells ring out in this moment is the certainty that God's truth concerning your belovedness is ringing out. Know that whatever you bring before God is being redeemed, no matter how seemingly insignificant or alarmingly overwhelming. In the name of Jesus Christ, you are forgiven. And then the bells ring out with confidence, right? So as I bring these words, I'm going to know that I can begin to, maybe I begin softly because that's where we are dynamically. And then by the end of that paragraph, I'm going to be saying that with confidence because the next thing that is happening is that the bells ring out with confidence. Oh, I hope you're seeing how fun it is to look at all these pieces and not just think, this is the music, these are the words, but to marry these things. It just brings the story completely alive and it moves us, right? Okay, which is what our goal. All right, so then I'm not going to go through this whole prayer, but I just want to point out a couple of things. When we get to the Sanctus, as a wordsmith, I've said, okay, what part of the holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory, Hosanna in the highest, what part of that will fit that little tune? And you might sit down with your music director if you're doing this. It's amazing how easy it is usually to put those words to a tune that you've been singing. So this is a great place where you and the music person can collaborate in coming up with something. So this is going to sing, Holy God of power and might, heaven and earth sing your praise. Hallelujah. Blessed is he who comes in your name. Heaven and earth sing your praise. Hallelujah. I changed that up. I got out of my head. But if I had Chuck Bell with me who helped arrange it and he was playing it, I would be able to sing it. But anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so then I get to the Thanksgiving too, and I do want to read just a little bit here. Holy are you, and blessed is your Son, Jesus Christ. Coming to us in the form of a baby, you reminded us that each one is precious. In his growing from child to adult, you reminded us that each of us can grow and change. In his ministry with the poor, sick, and oppressed, you reminded us that our true nature is compassion. In his death and resurrection, you reminded us that pain and violence and death do not have the last word. In his promise to be with us always, you remind us that it is never too late to turn the redeeming to turn to the redeeming power of your love. So you see how that the words begin to have a rhythm because I'm using you reminded us, you reminded us, you reminded us. Always finding a structure that flows and that does some of that repeating. Okay, I hope you're getting the idea. The last thing that I want to talk about here with the verbal arts is not only what we say, but how we say it. Verbal acts create nonverbal effects. How you say the words affects how we're going to take the content in. It is known through its performance, and this is not a bad word. It's the way we embody the form. That's performance. So meaning that's communicated in a face-to-face setting, i.e. worship, is 55% communicated by the body. Oh my gosh. Look how important the body is to the words that we have fashioned. 38 by the tone of voice. So the way we say it is so incredibly important. And only 7% by the actual words spoken. So if we really want people to hear those words that we have worked on, we have to not just write the words, but then we have to figure out where am I going to say this, right? How does my body and the placement of where I am affect what I'm saying? What's the tone of voice that I'm going to say these words in so that people can hear it? Where are my pauses? How am I going to do this? So Jana Childers has a book called Performing the Word, Preaching as Theater. And in it, she has some great, I highly recommend, if you want to work on your performance of words, read this book. I quote her quite a bit in my book, but if you want to go deeper, just get her book. Depth of breathing lends more power, freedom, and range to the voice. So if you work on your breathing, the words you have prepared are going to be more well communicated. Resonance, where the words are in the body. If you're always talking up here in your head voice and you never learn how to use your chest voice, then you only have a very small range. Articulation and enunciation. You even have to enunciate just to say those two words. Dealing with consonants and vowels and making sure that you are saying things in an articulate way that people can understand. And I would put with that rate of speed, because sometimes we talk too fast. I know I do, and especially right now when I know we're coming to the end of our webinar and I have more to do, right? But we have to pay attention to that. Tones of voice, flexibility that conveys emotion. So if we never fluctuate in our tone of voice, that's called monotone, right? And that is going to be flat and not conveying emotion as much as we want it to. Janice says that the 4 building blocks to interpret and express the life of a text, she calls it the art of orchestration. Love that. Rate, pitch, volume, and use of pause. All of these things we have to work on. My McFeeism, I always say, monotony happens in many forms. And when you have the same rate of speaking, and this is the number one problem when I'm working with preachers at churches that I'm consulting with, the number one problem that preachers have is a predictable rhythm. For instance, I'll say a sentence and then I slow down at the end. And I say another sentence and then I slow down at the end. And I say another sentence and I slow down at the end. Oh my gosh, we put our folks to sleep if we create that kind of rhythmic monotony. It doesn't matter how provocative, wonderful the words are. If we don't pay attention to all of these things, the art of orchestration, we're going to lose them, my friends. All right, training readers. I talk about this in the book, and it's really important for these very same reasons to train readers who are going to bring scripture, any part of the service, in teaching them how to lead, teaching them about the tone of their voice, about the rate and the pitch and all of those things, the use of pause. Writing sermons, if you're a manuscript preacher especially, you want to write out your sermons on the page. You want to lay them out on the page in a poetic format, not in paragraph form, because it's as soon as you have paragraph form and you're reading off the page, it's going to sound like you're reading to us, and that's what you're doing. So, it's good to move towards notes, but if you're a manuscript preacher, make some of your main points bigger font so that you can then look up. I do things like if I need a lot of notes because I haven't had time to internalize it all, and I know I'm going to look up during this story and I'm going to tell this story. And even if you're a manuscript preacher, I highly recommend that you find at least one or two stories in your sermon that you can say without looking at the page at all. You have to let go of the exact words that you want to say. You just have to let go. Although if you practice them enough without the paper, practice, those words will come back to you because your brain will get used to the phrases. But move away from the page, and then when I want to go back to my manuscript, I'm going to put a big old star right next to where I need for my eye to go, so that I'm not all of a sudden looking at a page and I have no idea where to look and where my next note is. So write in a poetic format that matches the oral interpretation that you want. All right, I give an example of that in the book. So what we say, how we say it, and where we say it. Where is the best place to do this pastoral prayer? Maybe not at the pulpit where you've just preached the entire sermon, if you're a pulpit preacher. You want to close the gap, and these are words that are more intimate, a more intimate address. Be closer to the people. Just figure out where would it be the best place, because crowds tune out with little kinesthetic stimulation. Body language, posture, distance, placement, all of these things are so vitally important. I quote Nick Morgan, who talks about being a kinesthetic speaker in the book. And these are really great advice for people who want for their communication to be heard. We heard that it's 55% based on the body, the retention is, and the comprehension by the congregation. 38 by the tone of voice. So what we're doing with our bodies is highly important. What are our gestures? What's the body language? All these things. It's not enough to just decide what words we're going to say. It's so vitally important we go to the next steps and practice and decide, orchestrate, choreograph where I'm going to be, when. All right, where we say it, what we say, how we say it, and how we see it. Last thing, whenever there's unison speaking, do not use a paragraph form. We want to make it in poetic format, and under no circumstances should you put a unison prayer in all caps. Oh my gosh. So hard to read, comprehend, etc. We want to put it like this, and that is with indentations for every thought line. We want to be able to see the comprehension, not just hear ourselves say it. So every time I have the end of this prayer, the last three lines, when we are hesitant, nudge us. So I've put nudge us a little indented so we can see to comprehend. When we are hesitant, nudge us. When we are frightened, calm us. When we are weary, give us strength. So we can see to comprehend. Poetic format. Worship guides. Don't print all the leader words. Oh my gosh, this is an example of what not to do. This slide that I have up right now. If you have all of the words that you are saying, this is a page with a communion prayer on it. People will read it. They will not choose to look at you. They will choose to read the words. Now, if you don't have good sound system or listening devices for people who can't hear very well, give them all the words. Give them a script. But most people, we want them, if communication relies 55% on body and 38% on tone of voice and facial expression, we want them to be watching, especially a ritual action such as communion. The words will come alive in the way that you present them, if you've done your homework and practiced that communion prayer so that you can bring those words alive. Let me just say one other thing about bringing those words alive. When you write a special prayer for communion and you want those words to be just right, be sure that you have your notebook, your script, in a place where you can easily see it and on a stand of some kind so you're not holding it, so that you can have free use of your body. Okay? And then practice it. Just practice it. Just go into the sanctuary and practice it. Your mind needs to have gone through it, not just silently, but out loud. Your mouth needs to have spoken it before you get in front of folks. All right. Worship guides covers are a place for symbolism and titles to prepare us for the message of worship. I often say put your synopsis for the whole series on that. You're going to have a different, for every series, you're going to have a different image on your worship guide, and give yourself, a leg up. And as soon as people sit down, they're going to look at that. Put the synopsis of the series right there. Even the watermark image can help tell the story and the way you put it on the page. Okay, friends. Whew. Don't forget, if you would like to have Advent Christmas completely done for you, of course you can tweak it to fit your situation. Please do get this series. I'm so excited about it. Even if you've already decided what you're doing for Advent Christmas this year, get it, download it for next year. It's just, I'm very, very excited about it, and I hope that you will use it. It's really a very cool series based on my friend Matt Rawls' book, The Redemption of Scrooge, about that story. Okay, so thank you so much for being on. I haven't seen any questions over here in the chat box, and so I just kept going. I hope that was okay. I'll just stay on for a couple more minutes here and see if there's any questions in the chat box. Otherwise, John says, yes, you can rewatch this. I always take the recording and I post it to my YouTube channel. And so just go to YouTube, type in Marcia McFee, you'll find my channel, and it will be up there later today or tomorrow morning, depending on when I can get it completely edited. And yes, you can rewatch this. We're also going to put these on the Think Like a Filmmaker pages, which are the bonus materials for the book. Every time you see something in the margin of the book that says, look at Think Like a Filmmaker for more on this, or for a video, or what have you, those are on the Think Like a Filmmaker web pages. And the way you get to those is to go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com, and then there's a form. Fill out that form, and we will email you the links to all of the pages, to all the chapters. And we're going to start posting these webinars that we're recording on each chapter, so that you just get more and more goodies with the book. All right, friends, thank you so much. Tell your friends about the book, Think Like a Filmmaker. People are writing in and telling me how much they're appreciating it, how much it's changing, and how much their worship team is really enjoying studying it and just getting tons of ideas between the two covers of that book. So thank you so much. It is my delight and pleasure to serve you. Many blessings. Bye-bye.